Hi, my name's Lara Spirit. I'm a reporter at The Times, and I'm delighted to be here today to host a very special event about a philosopher that I'm sure many of you will know, and if not, you'll learn about today, called John Rawls, but more broadly to discuss the role of philosophy, what the role of philosophy might be in a Labour government, in shaping how a Labour government might want to think about winning the next election. And we could not really have two better people to discuss this with. So Daniel Chandler, who is an economist and a philosopher and the author of a brilliant book called Free and Equal, that's out there if you haven't already seen it, today, who will be able to talk a lot about John Rawls and what we might be able to learn from him, and Liz Kendall, of course, Shadow Minister for Social Care, who is also deeply interested in the philosophical issues facing the Labour Party, and also has direct experience of the last time that the Labour government was preparing perhaps to enter government, and the role that philosophy played in shaping their approach towards that. So thank you both so much for joining today. And I think probably best first to start with Dan and this fantastic book that he's written, but predominantly the figure that's at the centre of that, the philosopher John Rawls. Could you maybe just start by giving people a little bit of an introduction as to why we think that John Rawls makes a kind of perfect figure to think about shaping this discussion, and why he's so relevant to many of the challenges that Labour might be facing today?
Yes, great, will do. Thanks, Lara. So John Rawls is really the towering figure of 20th century political philosophy. This is a thinker who's routinely compared to the sort of greatest minds in the history of Western thought, people like Plato, Hobbes, Kant, John Stuart Mill. And I think what's exciting about Rawls really is that his ideas are not just philosophically interesting, they're practically useful. We heard quite a lot this morning about the importance of hope in progressive politics, of offering a clear vision of what a better, fairer society would actually look like. And I think that's something that mainstream progressive parties have struggled with in recent decades. I think to some extent we're still living under the shadow of the 1980s, the ideas of Thatcher and neoliberalism, and I think part of the success of that set of ideas is that it was really grounded in sort of serious intellectual work by thinkers like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek. And I think although New Labour managed to challenge that to some degree, they were also constrained by the strength of that sort of intellectual consensus. And I think where Rawls really comes in is in offering an alternative, a sort of genuine big picture alternative to that set of ideas. Just briefly on so Rawls is an American philosopher. I probably should have said this before. He was born in 1921 in Baltimore, Maryland, died in 2002, spent most of his career as an academic at Harvard University, and his most famous book is A Theory of Justice that was published in 1971. It completely transformed philosophy as a discipline, political philosophy, and yet he's sort of relatively little known, I think, outside of academia, and his impact on real politics has been not that great. And part of the aim of my book, Free and Equal, is really to drag his ideas out of academia and into our public debate, where I think they have a lot to offer. Maybe I'll just sort of give a rundown of the key ideas so that we all have that in the background. So at the heart of his philosophy is, a sort of strikingly simple idea, which is that society should be fair. And obviously people disagree on exactly what fairness means, and Rawls put forward a famous thought experiment for working that out. So he argued that if we want to know what a fair society would look like, we should imagine how we would choose to organize it if we didn't know who we would be within that society. So whether we would be rich or poor, gay or straight, black or white. And I think, that's just an incredibly intuitive and powerful thought experiment. I think it's pretty obvious that if we thought that way, we wouldn't choose to organize society as we have it right now, where some people have to rely on food banks to feed themselves, or where, the random circumstances of birth shape people's life chances in such a fundamental way. And where Rawls takes that thought experiment, and I guess where his philosophy starts to get more practical, is he uses it to justify some fundamental principles, two real fundamental principles, one to do with freedom, one to do with equality, hence the title of my book. And those principles are really the basis for thinking through what a better society would look like. So the first principle he called the basic liberties principle. That's the idea that the first priority of the state is to protect a set of really fundamental freedoms, both personal freedoms like freedom of religion, sexuality, speech and thought, but also political freedoms, the freedoms that we need to play a part as genuine equals in the political process. And then his second principle, his equality principle, which is there to help us think through how we design our social and economic institutions, that's really got two parts. The first is what he called fair equality of opportunity, which is the idea that everyone should have an equal chance to develop their talents and abilities in life. And unlike many other liberal thinkers who've often stopped there and thought that as long as everyone has a fair start in life, inequalities maybe don't matter that much, Rawls argued that we needed to combine a commitment to equal opportunities with a genuine commitment to shared prosperity. And that comes to the second part of this principle, which is the difference principle, and that's the idea that we should organize our economy in a way that's so that the least well-off are better off than they would be under any alternative economic system. And in particular, Rawls was at pains to emphasize that when we think about the prospects of the least well-off, we shouldn't just be thinking about the distribution of money, of income and wealth, but also how our economy distributes power and control and opportunities for self-respect. In particular in relation to work. And then, so those are the two core principles. There's actually also a third principle that's often been overlooked, which is a principle of intergenerational justice and sustainability, the most basic requirement of which is to maintain the sort of stable climate and ecosystems on which society depends. So those three really principles are kind of a big picture framework, I guess, for thinking through how it is that we go about designing our political, social, economic institutions.
Brilliant. And I think one of the interesting things about the book, and one of the reasons so many people that were fascinated in Rawls were so excited to see that it was being written, was that it wasn't just a description of Rawls's philosophy, it was an interpretation of what Rawls's philosophy might mean for politics today. So I think it'd be quite helpful just in terms of looking at how you might put Rawls onto politics today.
Yeah.
What are some of the ideas in the book that come out of Rawls's philosophy for how we might think about organising politics?
Yeah, and that's really the main focus of the book, as you say. Rawls, I think part of the reason that Rawls hasn't had much influence on our wider public debate is that he didn't really say very much about how we could put those principles that I just mentioned into practice. And as both an economist and philosopher, my aim is not just to sort of convey his ideas to a wider audience, but really think through how we could put them into practice. Part of the appeal of his theory is that it offers a very comprehensive way of thinking about a huge range of questions in domestic politics, from questions about culture wars and the way that we organize our democracy through to the school system, equality of opportunity, the structure of the economy. So there's like a lot. I think that comprehensiveness is a big part of the appeal. And in the book, I try to sort of think through practical ideas across that broad spectrum. Or maybe I'll just focus on a couple of the areas that feel both most important to a progressive politics today, and also where I think Rawls has something distinctive to offer. First is reforming the political system, which I think is really a precondition for any wider project of political change. And I think there's also a huge appetite at the moment for changes to our political system. I think there was a Pew survey recently that found that more than half of people in the UK think that the political system either needs major reform or to be completely overhauled. So I think there is a significant appetite for change. I think one of the biggest, one of what's distinctive about Rawls's philosophy here is that first principle, which talks about political rights and freedoms. Rawls is clear that what matters isn't just that we have equal formal rights, like the right to vote or freedom of assembly. We have to have genuinely equal opportunities to exercise those rights and to actually take part in and influence the political process. And one of the problems with our political system at the moment, I think the place I would start in terms of practical reforms, is the role of private money in our political system. So in 2019, just over 100 super donors were responsible for around half of all donations to political parties, each of them giving nearly £450,000 each. And I think if political equality is the principle that underpins a democracy, that's clearly a ridiculous kind of system to have. And the solution that I make the case for in the book has two parts. The first is to restrict private donations to a very low level, and then to replace our quite complex system of public funding with a democracy voucher system where every citizen would be given an equal amount of money, say £50 per election cycle, that they could give to the party of their choice. And that would, I think, completely transform the incentives of our political system. In favour or? I think that's a big idea that actually people respond to incredibly well, and I think it's quite difficult to argue against. Obviously, it would represent a major change to the way that we fund political parties today, and I'm sure would be opposed by all sorts of people, particularly those donors who have so much influence at the moment. So that's, I think, reforming the political system would be the place to start. Democracy vouchers is one idea. I also make the case for proportional representation and for new ways of engaging citizens more directly in the democratic process through citizens' assemblies that where the members are selected at random and those sorts of changes. I think the other thing where rules can really help is in developing a new economic paradigm, which again this morning we were hearing about how absolutely central that has to be to any progressive agenda. And I think what we get from rules, I did talk about the difference principle before, didn't I?
You did, yeah.
Yeah, good. So, what that principle gives us is both an appreciation of the vital role that markets play, a pragmatic recognition that a degree of inequality can benefit everyone, but puts that alongside a really strong commitment to making sure that the benefits of that prosperity are genuinely widely shared, and not just leaving that to markets, because there's nothing inherent to how markets work, either in theory or in practice, that means that they will automatically deliver shared prosperity. And I think what's particularly valuable about rules' ideas is how they can help move us beyond a paradigm where the solution to inequality is, where redistribution is the only or the go-to solution to inequality. And that comes back to this importance that rules places on questions about power and control and dignity and self-respect. So for rules, redistribution isn't enough really for two reasons. First, because a system that's just based on redistribution can undermine the sense of reciprocity that's so important to a stable and progressive society, but also because it recognizes that work isn't just a source of income, it's a source of meaning and identity and self-respect. And I think in practical terms, that points towards a policy agenda that's focused on equipping people with marketable skills, with human capital, and also trying to bring about a much more equal distribution of ownership and wealth. And if we have those two things are really the centerpiece of a kind of Rawlsian political economy. If people had a more equal, if we had a more equal distribution of human capital, of skills, and of ownership, then we wouldn't need to rely on redistribution anywhere near as much as we do today. And the second thing, I think, is thinking again about the balance of power between workers and owners. I think we tend to take it for granted the way in which power is almost exclusively concentrated in the hands of shareholders today. And we need to remember that that's a choice that we've made, and we don't have to look very far to find quite radically different ways of doing things. In Germany, workers and owners share power on a much more equal basis, and so that's another of the directions that I think Rawls's ideas can move us in.
Fantastic, brilliant. And Liz, I'm quite keen to bring you in. And we've been talking about the role of philosophy in the labour movement and in coming up with those ideas, and obviously listening to Dan talk about the influence of rules and how we might be able to interpret him to think about looking towards a Labour government. What kind of value do you think that has, and what are the thinkers that you think you would draw most from in the way that Daniel has for rules?
I think the role of ideas in politics is essential, because if you don't know what you stand for, you'll fall for anything. And those guiding principles have always been hugely important to me. I'd say, if I think about the influences on me, I suppose it starts with my family, and it's often said that the Labour Party owes more to Methodism than Marxism, and that is certainly the case for me. You wouldn't be surprised to hear. I'm not religious myself, but my family were Methodists. They were non-conformists. For those of you who don't know what that means, the non-conformists were, really against the sort of hierarchical paternalism of the Anglican Church. They believed not just in preaching to the faithful, but social action. It was all about putting your policies into your beliefs into practice, and it was also about the role of lay people, not just priests. And in my family, we were always sort of taught our family will do better if our area does better. And so they were very involved in the local community. And the other thing that was absolutely crucial to Methodism and in my family was the role of Sunday schools. Education was the key to a more fair and equal society. So that's on a personal level from my family background. But as I grew up, I would say certainly I was, and the time that I was very involved in politics, I was very influenced by Tony Crosland and the future of socialism. And I think those values are still very important for me today. Firstly, that a successful Labour Party needs to distinguish between the means and the ends, that our values remain the same, but we have to interpret them in new ways in a changing world. Secondly, that we cannot win if we have a class-based politics alone. We have to have a national mission that builds together support from the working and the middle classes. Thirdly, it must be a moral endeavour, by which I mean it is not simply about the fair distribution of material goods, vital though that is. It is about the quality of life and in enabling people to have private enjoyment and self-fulfilment. And that links to the thing that is really important for me, is he was very wary of the strand of paternalism. You'll see the links here, the paternalism in some strands of the Labour Party, which is telling people what they should do, what they should want, and what they should think. Whereas Crosland believed the role of the state was to give people the capabilities and the power to live the life they choose, not the life we choose for them. And finally, he argued that we need to really understand social and cultural change. He thought there was too much sort of sentimentalism about the past. And I definitely believe that we as progressives must tell the truth that the world is changing, not that we can bring back the past, but it will give people the power to cope with that change. And those ideas, I think, were very much part of New Labour, reforming the Labour Party. They remain true today. And if there's one thing that I'm thinking more and more about, I think there are some links with rules here, which is, how do you genuinely give people power and control over their lives? You know, I believe we should win power in order to give it away. And we need to reclaim liberty for the left. And I think if there is one thing that is the theme throughout my life, it is to give that power and control to people over their own lives. That means challenges the unfairnesses of the market, but it also means being really wary about the paternalism of the state. And that's the sort of radical model of politics that I've always believed in, and that I hope that the next Labour government will deliver.
It's really fascinating. I mean, talking about Tony Crosland, he was a philosopher, but he was also a politician, obviously. And listening to you talk, it does raise that question of the role of a philosopher in the Labour Party, right? Because when Tony arrived in Parliament, he was famously unclubbable, and people would complain about that here was this person who turned up as this kind of great missionary and voice of socialism that had been so inspiring to so many of them. And then they found him actually quite disinterested in organising in many ways within the party, and couldn't understand why he wasn't fascinated in the kind of Machiavellian ways of Parliament. And I'm interested in what you think in terms of, what do you think there are that many philosophers among MPs right now? And do you think that they have the kind of Tony Crosland approach of actually, I'm here as an MP and I'm not necessarily going to be the kind of voiceover of this amazing book that I've written for everybody else to act on?
I think there's much more of an emphasis on the practical politics today. I think there's been a huge change over the decades from, and I think rightly so, from politicians who believed, they never needed to even visit their constituencies. They just needed to speak in Parliament and maybe go once or twice a year. But that has been the case in the past. But I do think ideas are important, because politics both seems to be a maelstrom of things changing incredibly quickly on the one hand, and also painfully slow at picking up on the longer term trends. And when you're faced with that, you have to be very clear about your principles, the end goals to which you seek, in which to deal with all of the stuff that's going to come your way. So I believe ideas are essential, but the challenge, and I think this is also the challenge, when you think about rules, is you've got to bring people with you. you have to bring people with you. And they are not starting from an intellectual exercise. They're starting from paying the bills, wanting to go on holiday and get back home at night safe or get an operation. They haven't got time for that. So this is the challenge for politics, is to bridge the principles and ideas with the practical realities of people's lives. And I think this is going to be a really big issue for us as a party in the coming year. We have, for the first time since I've been elected, I believe we have a chance. We have a genuine chance of winning power. But our biggest challenge is people feel hopeless. They don't believe things can change. They are knackered. They're tired. They can't get a passport, let alone an operation. And so we have big visions. You know, I remember, excuse me for this, in 1997 on the pledge card, we had, I think it was take a couple of 100,000 people off the waiting list by scrapping a couple of tens of thousands of NHS managers. On the one hand, we had the left saying that's pathetic, it's tiny, you know, why aren't you more ambitious? And on the right, we had people saying you'll never be able to do that. What we actually ended up doing was ending waiting. We ended waiting in the NHS, but we brought people with us. We showed them they could trust us. We showed them that we would deliver, and they gave us more than one term, and we needed more than one term to make the changes we need. So our goal has got to be to bring people with us, and I think that's the challenge for political philosophy, is how you really make that happen on the ground.
That's interesting. And I guess Daniel Free and Equal is in many ways an example of really trying to do that. All the more interesting because in many ways Rawls is not seen as this kind of great progressive thinker to quite a lot of young people. I remember at university, a lot of people would want to study Marx. People that were interested in progressive philosophy very much wouldn't often go near Rawls. And what you've done is to say actually, which is quite bold, right? To say actually Rawls is really at his heart a really progressive thinker. And that is an example of trying to bring people with you. How successful do you think it's been so far? What's the reaction been to the claim that Rawls is a really a bold and at heart progressive thinker? Yeah,
actually the reception has been really amazing, and what's been interesting is how people are interested in responding to Rawls's ideas from right across the political spectrum, both from sort of right on the left, people like Owen Jones, through to people more in the centre, and through to like, you know, I've had great Jesse Norman, who's a Conservative MP, wrote a lovely endorsement for the book, and it's sort of intriguing the degree to which Rawls's ideas are able to appeal in principle to a very broad spectrum of people, and I think that's part of what's politically attractive also about his ideas, is that they start from somewhere, from an idea of fairness and a set of principles that lots of people can sign up to. It was interesting, just thinking about you mentioning Marx as the place that most people go to. Actually, one of the reasons I wrote the book, well, sort of inspiration right at the beginning, was reading an article by Paul Mason about how Marx is the thinker, you know, the most relevant thinker for now. And in particular, he was sort of emphasizing the young Marx's writings that weren't published until after he died, where Marx set out an ethical critique of capitalism and a critique of the way that capitalism prevents people from living flourishing lives. And I sort of was reading it and thinking, I sort of agree that that's the most compelling bit of Marx, but that if you really want to pick those ideas up today, I don't think you would look to the Marxist tradition. I think this contemporary liberal tradition is the tradition that you would look to. And it's because, you know, just thinking also about what you were saying, Liz, about combining freedom and equality and, you know, the need for progressive politics to put freedom at its heart and to focus on allowing people to lead the kinds of lives that they want to lead. I think that's the sort of key philosophical strength of Rawls's framework, is that it really shows how these two values belong together and how they fit together in practical terms. It's not just a sort of vague assertion that we need both freedom and equality. What we get from Rawls are these principles that set out exactly which freedoms matter most, how much equality we should be aiming for, and you know, and when it's, you know, what kinds of freedoms we can, you know, to the extent to which we can interfere, I suppose, in markets in order to bring that about. What else was I had various things I was thinking as Liz was talking that I also wanted to comment. I think it's interesting thinking about Tony Crosland, because I think Rawls sits very much in that same sort of social democratic, left liberal, democratic socialist tradition, and was actually quite influenced by, he spent some time in Oxford in the 60s, and was actually very influenced by revisionist sort of socialist thinkers like Tony Crosland. And I think really what his ideas do is really provide a secure, a more solid sort of intellectual foundation for that kind of, that way of thinking. And I suppose what I've tried to do in the book is then, as you say, like maintaining Crosland's emphasis on the distinction between means and ends, to take rules as an inspiration for setting out what our ultimate ends might be, and then think through what it would look like to put that into practice here and now.
I think just on Crosland and the kind of run up to a possible Labour government and the thinkers that you would place in this, you obviously spent time at IPPR in the 90s leading up to that. I wonder if when you listen to Daniel, you think, yeah, there is a real role for these thinkers in trying to frame the way that we might want to pitch ourselves for power.
I mean, absolutely. And you talked about the role of right-wing thinkers and also the think tanks. I'm sorry, I'm so old now to be telling you all about this, and I'm sure many of you know anyway. But the think tanks around Thatcher and the 80s were hugely influential in shaping the climate. And at the time, on the left, we realised we didn't have something similar. And when Neil Kinnock was leader, the Institute for Public Policy Research was established. People like Patricia Hewitt, David Millerman were there. The huge Commission on Social Justice that was begun under John Smith was trying to rethink the welfare state, trying to unpick this means and ends. So, for example, at the time we had a fixed minimum wage per hour. There was a modernised policy of the Low Pay Commission that would bring together employers and employees to decide what a minimum wage could be at the level that was good for workers but didn't create unemployment. That was a big modernisation and a big row and debate at the time. Now we've said we will take that a step further by also putting within the minimum of the Low Pay Commission's remit, looking at what a living wage would be. So I think that's very interesting. And certainly when I was there, many of the themes that you've talked about were issues we looked at. The first book I ever wrote was something called Citizens' Juries. It was in 1992, which is a way to involve ordinary people in difficult decisions, to say, actually, the public isn't stupid, you give them enough evidence, time to deliberate. In people's day-to-day lives, they're always making trade-offs, and they can do that for public policy too. But it's taken 20-30 years for those to be put into practice. And certainly another thing that I was involved with while I was there was a book called Equal at One. What would it take to make every child equal at one? Because scientific advances have shown us just how important the first pregnancy and the first 1 or 2 years of a child's life are for shaping the way the brain is developed, for their later life chances. And so we would try, it's this balance. You want to give people the skills and abilities to fulfill their potential, but you also have to say that what can you put in place to make that a genuine chance? And that was one of the books. So a lot of the things that you've talked about shaped those policies. And what I would say is this. First of all, it's lovely to be able to have this debate now without being shouted down for, genuinely, for not holding a hard left line, but for understanding that these issues are difficult. And secondly, we shouldn't be afraid of ideas and people actually pushing the boat out. Because in politics, when you've got people pulling you along, that's very important, which is why I think the book that you've written and the work that others are doing, pushing the Labour Party, is something we should welcome and not be frightened of, because that is how you make change happen, to have those bold ideas that you don't necessarily implement everything that's being said, but it helps shape the culture and the climate, and that's why the ideas in politics are so important.
And how does the ideas ecosystem now compare to your experience in the 90s and the rock? Because there's often that kind of claim, isn't there, that there were so many rich ideas swirling around people at 97, and there was this great ecosystem. And is it fair to say that you think that that's lapsed at all?
No, No, I think different organisations are, things wax and wane. I think IPPR still doing great work, but I also think of the Resolution Foundation. I mean, they have played a huge role in shaping the debate about those on low incomes, the policies that might be required to change the outcomes there, and they are very aware that politics is about choices. They are clear about the difference politics can make. So I think it changes over time, but I think we could do with more. I think that we have made huge progress that I would not have thought imaginable after the 2019 election. I've said this before, but we had a mountain to climb. That mountain was Everest. We've smashed through base camp, but we are not at the summit. And that is the hardest bit to get to. And so the more that we have those ideas in debate to help us, the better.
Mm. And Daniel, you obviously spent time at the Resolution Foundation. It's slightly different, isn't it? The kind of think tank ecosystem and the philosophy ecosystem. Mm. Do you think the Labour Party or the Labour movement is good at melding those two things? Or do you think, and if it was going to be better, how might you improve the kind of communication and work that's done between the two of them?
That's a great question. Yeah, I don't think it's that great at the moment at doing that. I feels like there's quite a disconnect between these kind of bigger picture, longer term thinking and the work that think tanks do. My sense is actually that the think tank ecosystem is in better shape than the bigger picture, long term kind of thinking. I think it's quite hard to point to many serious efforts to really think through a long-term agenda for progressive politics. And that, I guess that was the reason why I wrote the book, is a feeling that those kinds of reference points that have been so important to the success of the Labour Party in the past, I think that's true in sort of 1945 for that post-war government. It was also true for 97 that the Labour Party could look to thinkers like Tony Giddens and Will Hutton, who did sort of set out those kind of bigger picture, longer term ideas. I think it is harder to find those reference points today. And I also think that maybe the opportunity is different now. I think there's more of a sense that the sort of ideas that underpinned Thatcherism and that sort of neoliberal consensus have run their course, and that it's possible to move beyond them in even more substantial way than New Labour tried to do, but sort of rising to the scale of that challenge also requires a sort of a philosophy that's on the same scale. And I think that's where someone like Rawls comes in.
And I guess there is that slight tension, as you say, of wanting to understand that the issues that the Labour Party needs to be alive to and address now can't be done by reference often to like lofty philosophical principles, and you're in danger of being accused of losing your focus in some way. What do you think the ways of making sure that you appreciate what Daniel's saying, which is like those great philosophical visions that you have in thinkers like John Rawls, with the ability to be able to pitch yourself as a party that really understands the challenges that actual people are facing?
So I think you need all different types of politicians, some who are more interested in the longer term philosophical thinking, the campaigners, the organisers, the debaters in Parliament, the policy wonks, and we want a huge ecosystem, not identikit politicians. I do think the pressure to be one type of politician is quite great, actually, and we suffer as a result. We need those different types of people, and I think that's actually quite a long-term challenge if you believe that you're part of a progressive movement, that we should foster that. We should foster that in our universities and our constituencies. And for the party, that's part of not just rebuilding for the next election, but for the next 10, 20, 30 years or more.
Mm. Can I just... Yeah, I was thinking, Liz, what you were saying before about it being important for politicians not to be afraid of big ideas. And I think that's important in both directions. I think that's exactly right, that both for politicians not to be afraid of ideas that really look long-term beyond what might be possible at the next election. But also, I think there's a similar responsibility for people who want to set out that long-term vision, not to get upset, to recognize the realities, political realities, and the need for political pragmatism. And I think that's, another thing that's attractive about Rawls is that I think that sits very well with his philosophy. And so I think that sort of is I think I'm just basically agreeing that I think that dialogue in both ways is what's really needed, and a recognition that both long-term vision and political pragmatism are needed, and that's the art of politics, I suppose, is working out how to translate these
and it's actually carving out the time for this, because if we're not doing this, if we are lucky to get into government, having worked in government twice myself as an advisor, I mean, we think we're busy now. We're not. We're really, really not. Government is really, really busy. So if we can't be carving out that time now for these discussions and ideas, when are we going to do it?
Yeah. I was just going to say, that was my, I having worked in think tanks and also spent a couple of years working in the Prime Minister's strategy unit in the Cabinet Office, and I was very conscious of not as a politician, so it's, the demands on my time were only a fraction of what they would be on yours, but the lack of space for this kind of thinking, I think, really was very striking to me, and was why I decided to take the time out to do this. And I think exactly finding a way for these activities to happen in parallel, and then for dialogue to take place between them is so important. And I think maybe think tanks could do more to do that. I think maybe there's a tendency to focus on evidence, on making sort of practical, I suppose, on just a sort of what works type approach to problem solving, and a slight nervousness to engage with more moral or philosophical ideas. And I think it would be helpful for there to be a bit more openness within the think tank world, as I suppose those I think are the institutions that are best placed to do the translating from big picture philosophy into practical politics. They're the kind of the middle institutions that are so essential, and maybe there's more room for this kind of thinking there.
It's interesting. I guess also, this morning, Keir was talking about 1964 as one of the examples of going into government and wanting to rebuild the economic model, which of course is what Daniel's talking about with regard to rules. But I suppose something that might be slightly foreboding in the example of 1964 is, of course, that it didn't, by virtue of the result, lend itself to a political system where you could have big, bold change, right? It was, in the end, a pretty unstable system that needed an election fairly soon after, and that for its duration in that first government was dominated by that question of devaluation. And I guess that's another question that I wonder if you're asking yourself is kind of, is it going to be too exciting for Labour on the cusp of power in a situation where actually the inheritance that you've got could be so invidious that the chances of doing any of this philosophy ends up or big changes ends up disappointing people by the lack of kind of political opportunity to really do it?
Not if you believe that whilst extra investment is vital, that alone isn't enough. You must be relentless about reform. Not simply because we will have to make choices because of the state of the public finances, but because everything from our criminal justice system to our health and care system to education, lifelong learning, need big changes to make them fit for the future. If you think about the area myself and Wes are responsible for the NHS and social care, you wouldn't, if you thought about an original position for that, you wouldn't be starting here. It was the NHS was created when the cause of most diseases was infectious illness, was infectious diseases and accidents. Average life expectancy was 63. Now, the biggest disease burden, cancer, coronary heart disease, dementia, linked to lifestyle, and life expectancy is 80, and 1 in 4 babies born today are going to live to 100. You would not have a system dominated by hospitals. That would be completely not where you would start. You would have something which is about giving people more power and control to live longer, healthier lives, not just more years of life, but more life in those extra years. We barely ever talk about an ageing society. We think as if the only issue is pensions and social care. Those are really important. But, people age 65, they're not old. People age 65 plus now. They're not old. As my mum's 70 and she talks about when she goes and helps the olds, which is somebody else. She does. And she also says, you lot, which is politicians, you lot shouldn't be surprised there's so many of us olds. We've been born a long time. And she's right, but we haven't thought about how that will affect everything from the world of work, caring responsibilities, 1 in 5 women aged 55 to 60 now are caring for an elderly relative. 1 in 5. We don't even talk about it. Childcare, yes, we've got to make, after the Tories have decimated the childcare system, we need big change there. But social care and care is as important now. They're both a part of our economic infrastructure. They're the missing bits of the welfare state. So there are big changes we need to make, but they are about reform, not just money. So I am under no illusions about what we will face. If you look at every sector, it's, things aren't working. But even with more money, it wouldn't work. I don't want to pour more money into a system that's failing. We have to change the system too. And we as progressives have to be relentless on reform.
Danny, can I talk? It is a really interesting point. Can you apply the original position to public services, for example? Because when we think about this, we often think about what it means for political organisation. But I think there's a question of Labour on the cusp of power, like Liz says. Is it possible to use the way that Rawls is thinking on public services as well, on reform?
Yeah, so the original position, that's the name for Rawls's this thought experiment where you imagine society if you didn't know who you would be within it. And I do, so that's not a big focus of the book, Public Sector Reform. I do talk a lot about the importance of education for equality of opportunity and the things that we could do in that sphere. I feel like that thought experiment would also yield insights in public services, but I think it would not be wise for me to just riff off the top of my head on them on them right now. Just to come back to what, I suppose this question of how much change is possible now in the political climate that we face, and also given a lack of money. I think just 2 points to make. One is just to, I think, remember the degree to which politics and politicians can shape the public mood and the kinds of policies that are possible. I think sometimes we sort of, there's a tendency to follow too much and for politics to be too dominated by focus groups and opinion polling, and a loss of the sense of political agency that we really do have. And I think we are in a moment where there is an appetite for that kind of change. And I think, as Keir was saying this morning, the Labour Party has done a very good job of establishing its credibility, providing reassurance. And I think now is the time to make arguments for a bigger, bolder reforming agenda. And, I set out some ideas in the book. I'm not necessarily expecting or hoping that the Labour Party will go all the way and suggest them as the right things for the next election. But all of the ideas in the book also provide a direction of travel, and it's possible to to move in the right direction, even if we don't jump, all the way, all in one go. And just on things that we can do that don't cost lots of money, a big focus of the book is on this question of democracy within the workplace. And I think that's a particularly important area that is, I think, somewhat missing from our current public debate. I think it has a lot of political potential and salience because of how it connects with questions about dignity and self-respect, and the need for a richer conversation about how we spend our days and our lives, and a discussion of inequality that isn't all about money. I think, and I feel like there's a lot of recognition that those themes are important, but the practical ideas about how we might bring about more meaningful work are often quite hard to find. There's a lot of just sort of appealing to the enlightened self-interest of businesses and hoping that this might just happen automatically. And I think that is that's a sort of naive way to think. But if we really do want to make work more meaningful, we obviously can't do that from the top down. No one wants a sort of department for meaningful work going into companies and telling them how to design their jobs. And I think the thing that we need to do is empower workers to shape work in ways that are meaningful to them, and to make the trade-offs between wanting to make money and have a decent income with wanting to have a different, more enjoyable working life, and to sort of decentralize those kinds of decisions. And it's not about putting workers and owners in opposition. It's about changing the structure of our economy so that those groups work in partnership and can be both, successful and competitive in a market economy, but also create jobs that, mean that people can enjoy their daily lives and get a sense of community and fulfillment from what they're spending their time doing.
Interesting, fascinating. I just want really quickly to have a couple of questions, if it's possible, for us to make time for. Wow, hands shooting up. Tom, John.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Very interesting presentations. I wanted to deal with the equality in education issue with an acid test application of Rawls. By the way, talking of age, I think I did attend one of Rawls's lectures in Oxford in the 60s.
I'm jealous.
I couldn't quite give you the resume of it, but still. So, here's my acid question. Lifelong learning you mentioned, skills you mentioned. To you, Daniel, in the book, do you talk about FE colleges or do you just talk about higher education? And to Liz, the question is, will the Labour Party give the college sector as much prominence as it gives the university sector?
Shall I go first? Yeah, so that's a big focus of the book, is exactly on the need to focus much more on the more than 50% of the population who don't go to university. And I think the difference principle that I talked about guides us towards focusing on how the extent to which the least well-off benefit from economic prosperity. And I think if we think that way, that would guide us much more to the importance of investing in skills for people who don't go to university. So that's so in the book, I'm not in favour of free tuition for all at the university level. I think that money would be better spent on the things that would make the biggest difference to equality of opportunity, which is, I think, spending more in the early years. And when it comes to inequality, I think that the focus should be on those who aren't going to university. That I think that we need to be shifting in that direction. So I think I'm on board with where you're coming from on that front.
Implication.
Well, I'm in a lather of agreement with you about the early years. I think the single biggest difference we could make in terms of equality. I mean, my kids in Leicester West, in the poorest backgrounds, they start school 20 months behind their better off peers. You know, they are playing catch up for the rest of their lives. So that is where our priority should be. And yes, we will give further education equal prominence. I mean, if I look at my own city, Leicester, we low skill, low wage. We will never transform that, which is vital to individual opportunity and vital to economic growth, unless we really support our FE sector. I don't know who was in the session earlier with Ali McGovern. We have got to devolve responsibility for skills down to the local level. We would make very different decisions in Leicester, certainly from the current government. But ESOL, for example, absolutely essential for us to improve life chances in Leicester. We need to have those partnerships with our businesses. The biggest things businesses will say to me is the young people are leaving school, they're not job ready. That's the kind of confidence and other sorts of skills, communication, and that's all done in our FE sector. And I also look at health and social care. We need an army of care workers in future if we're going to help older people live decent lives and save money for the NHS. So there's lots that we need to do there, and we are definitely championing it. I am, certainly.
Do you think we can take a couple at a time, if that's okay, just in the middle there?
Hi, Polly Billington, parliamentary candidate for South Thanet. I'm struck particularly by Liz's talking about applying our values to a changing environment, and particularly the importance of giving people freedom to be able to make their own decisions in that context. And particularly, I'm thinking about this in terms of the new challenges that are facing us when it comes to climate change. There's two different conflicting answers at the moment on climate change. One is you set the direction of travel and the market will deliver, and it's all about technology, or a really dangerous kind of degrowth strategy, which is about telling people what they can and can't do. And we've got to be able to navigate some kind of progressive path between these two. And I know we're developing an industrial strategy, and we've got a clean air target, and we've got a clean energy target and things like that. But I'm interested in thinking about how you apply those Croslandite principles to something which is an existential threat. So it's like, it's nothing they thought about in 1945, right? All of our lifestyles and all of our economy is entirely built on dependence on something which is basically destroying us. How do we navigate a progressive path on that?
Hi, I'm Rowan Buckley and I run the Labour History Research Unit at Ruskin University. This is for Daniel, really. Equality of opportunity, most people would agree with that, including, I'm sure, Jesse Norman, actually, people on the right. It is a really difficult question, equality of outcome. To what extent should the modern left be about equality of outcome using your kind of scheme?
Shall I start with that? Okay. So I think that it's not about equality of outcome, but about fair outcomes. And that's what the difference principle, I suppose, tries to give us a sense of what that would mean. So fair outcomes or inequalities are fair in as much as they contribute, in as much as everybody benefits them, and particularly those who have less. So it's not a philosophy that's advocating for a rigid kind of equality of outcome, because that, in a perfectly equal society, we will probably all be worse off than we could be than in a society where a degree of inequality is justified. So I think that's the distinctive bit that Rawls adds to that the sort of old debate about equality of opportunity versus outcome, as if you have to have one or the other. You have to care about either opportunities or outcome. I think what Rawls shows us is that we can care about opportunity and about outcome. And I think, often in these debates, the analogy of a race is used, and equality of opportunity is about giving everyone a fair start in the race or in the sort of competition for life. And I think that what Rawls adds is that we should also care about whether the prizes are fair. So it's, do we want a winner-takes-all type of system, which I think is quite similar to what we have now, or one in which the prizes are fair in some sense? And I guess he's supplying with us with a way of thinking about what fair might mean.
And it's just quickly on the climate question.
Yeah, Polly, that is a hugely important question, especially as we don't have 2 decades to wait to change public opinion. So how do we show that the change that we need to make, otherwise we don't exist, can benefit people? We have made a good start in terms of talking about insulating people's homes to bring the cost of their bills down, the jobs that would be created, but I think we need to do more, because it is a huge commitment that we've made, vital that we've done it, but translating it into something that means something to people in Leicester West who don't have an offshore wind farm by them and what's a green job. So it is the jobs, it is the people's bills and the state of their homes. It's much more wide, and I think there's more work we need to do, because we've got to bring people on quickly. I think that there's more we could do around electric cars. People do want it, but they just don't trust it at the minute, and it's far too expensive. How to accelerate that? We've got to translate it into something concrete that people in every part of the country feel they will benefit from. So more to do there, and I'm sure when you're there sitting on the green benches with us, you'll be setting out the entire policy, Polly, or at least I hope so.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up there. We've gone ever so slightly over, so I'll wrap up quickly. But just to say thank you, Daniel, so much for placing Rawls at Politics' doorstep. It's been long overdue, and I'm sure to many people in the room and elsewhere, very welcome. To say to everybody else that Daniel's book will be available outside, and I think we'll be able to sign a couple of them. Yes. Brilliant. So do get yourself a copy if you've not read it. It's obviously a brilliant book, and is full of so many rich ideas that are obviously very worth considering. And Liz, thank you so much for thinking about how we might translate some of those into politics going forward, and for what the role of them might be in a Labour Party that is to win. So thank you both so much. Thanks.